I've been thinking a lot of recently, especially coming off of last year with the bankruptcy and everything, is that like we don't own anything. You come into this life with nothing, you leave with nothing. Like all the chips that you accumulate in the middle, they just end up going back into circulation the moment that you're done playing the game, and they were never yours to begin with. And so like I think so much of the existential angst that we often feel is this fear of like, what if I lose it all? What if I have to start over from zero? And just a recognition that you already have nothing, technically speaking. Like, and if you think you own like your house, like try not paying your taxes, right? Like, you don't own anything. It's all just rented. It's all just for a period of time. And I think the beauty of that idea is once you realize like you were born with nothing and that what you're playing with was house money, they gave you a stack of chips and they said, good luck, Godspeed. Like you have nothing to lose. So like you might as well go for it. You might as well play all out because at one way or the other, the chips are going to get pushed in at the end. And so the other side of that is like, don't rest on your laurels and think that you've made it just because you have all this cool stuff. Cause you can get one phone call in the morning. This weekend we spent 3 hours in the emergency room with our puppy Zoe because she ate something that they do sometimes, and like your life can change on a dime. You think that you have so much time, you think you have so much stuff, but it can just be taken from you in an instant. And if you attach your identity to those things that you think that you own, it can be devastating, right? It could have been. I know people who have lost far less than what I lost in the bankruptcy last year that it absolutely crushed. And it's because they tied their identity to the things that they own, right? The things that you own end up owning you. And it's that same idea, like you don't own anything. You don't own anything. So don't let anything own you. I think risk is a really hard concept for a lot of people to understand. It's something that nobody taught me during my school. Like you learn about it from like a statistics and probability perspective, but nobody really has a good definition for it. If you think about like how you would define risk relative to how I might define it, or how Warren Buffett would define it, or how the guy living on the street would define it, like we all have different metrics and different ways of quantifying it. And so, in a lot of ways, like your skills and your capacity are the ultimate hedge against risk from an existential perspective. And so, like if you're not willing to put in the time and the energy to risk a little to potentially gain a lot, like you put in your time to learn a skill, you put in the time to grow your network, put in the time to gain resources, like that's a risk because it might not pay off. But if you don't do that, then on a long enough time frame, like the universe is going to come around and is going to kick you in the kneecaps. And your ability to weather storms in life is predicated on your abilities, your skills, your resources, your networks. And so like the ultimate risk is to go through life thinking that you're not taking, like that you're trying to play a safe game, that you're like not putting yourself out there. And I think the at the end of the day, like the risk of mediocrity is far greater than the risk of failure. And when I say that, people think like, oh, like who are you to call me mediocre? And it's not about like saying you're mediocre or below average. It's just saying like accepting the status quo is the ultimate risk, because the only universal in the universe is change. The status quo will not remain. And so if you aren't willing to continue moving forward, then eventually the universe is going to move forward without you, and you're going to find yourself getting left behind. Like the more successful people that I meet, like there was a conversation I had, this was, I don't know, 7 years ago. I sat down with a billionaire and we had lunch, and I remember in that conversation thinking like, this guy is nothing special. Like he's telling me about how he started his business, how he grew it. And I was like, this guy he didn't have a clue what he was doing. He was dumb enough to start and too stupid to quit. Like that was it. Like he's like, I'll just figure it out. And he was stupid enough to believe that he could make it work. And then long after like the period where most people would have given up because they weren't getting the results that they expected, he just kept going. So he's like, all data points are saying like, this isn't working, you should give up. And he's like, I'll just pivot. And after like the seventh pivot, when most people would have just long ago said, nah, this isn't going to do it, it finally worked. And he looked like a genius. And so like all that time, in hindsight, you can look back on it and be like, you can connect the dots in hindsight. And you can say like, obviously the path that he took to get here, like, of course he had to do this and that to learn this skill and then have this network and like that connection. But that's only in hindsight. In the moment when you're living through that, you just look like a freaking idiot. Because everybody else is like, dude, this has failed 5 times. Take a freaking hint. Like insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Like go get a job, go do the other thing. And when you go against society's norms, when you go against people's expectations, now you're a contrarian and you're wrong 99% of the time, except for the 1% of the time that you're right. And that's really the only time that ultimately matters. Because at that point you've won, you proved them wrong. But like for majority of the journey, you're going to look like an idiot. And so your capacity to not care about that, to go for your dreams, to go for the thing that other people say is like unlikely and unreasonable, is the first prerequisite for even accomplishing that thing. Because if you're not willing to take the first step to go for it and to potentially look stupid and fall on your face and look like an idiot, you're never going to get to the place that you desire, regardless of how ambitious or not that is. So I think when I'm looking at hiring, when I look at like the successful people that I've had good working relationships in the past, the correlation that I found was everybody has like a baseline intelligence. Like you can't, you have to have a certain raw horsepower, but you don't need to have an extraordinary amount. And in fact, at a certain point, like being too intelligent is not super helpful. Hard work isn't a prerequisite. It is a prerequisite, but it's not a distinguishing factor because everybody has that, right? And so like you can have intelligent people who work hard, but like curiosity is this magical quality that I find in high agency people. It's the people who are just, it's not curious about just what to do, but why it works. And they go digging deeper to understand the connections. And what I found is that the people who are the best at that, at collecting the dots and then finding ways to connect it through creativity, like they're world changers. They don't just accept the way something is because people say that's how it always has been. They just go, why has it always been that way? And then they challenge it and they say, why don't we try it this way? And everybody goes, because that way is stupid. And they go, well, I'm going to try it. And then it works. And they're like, you're a genius. They're like, no, I was just willing to look stupid, right? Tying back to the other one. But like curiosity and the willingness to continue digging and learning. And this is a lesson not just for like your ability to find that trait in other people, but in yourself too. Like the reason successful people stagnate and they start to backslide is because a lot of the things that got them to where they are traits that they stopped adhering to, right? Like they get to the place where, especially with curiosity, it's like, I'm successful. I have all the answers. And now I can't afford to look like an idiot. Now I can't afford to look like a beginner. And so in a lot of ways, mastery becomes this prison keeping you from continued learning if you attach your identity to being the person that has achieved a certain level of skill. For me, like this was really true in rock climbing. A great example of this. I spent many, many years at the top level of that game. And then as I got older, as I had some injuries, as I started to like fade and my love of the game like started to wane, I was no longer anywhere near the tip of the spear. And yet my identity still attached to that, right? But because I was sliding, what needed to happen for me to like go and regain the former glory was to get curious about what needed to be different about my life, my training, my process of moving forward. But I was so tied to this idea that I was a master, that I was the master, that there wasn't anything to continue learning. I couldn't afford to go into the gym and look like a beginner again because my identity was tied to something greater. It kept me from actually doing the things necessary that would have allowed me to grow. And so like the lesson there is just like the master has failed more than the beginner has ever even tried. And the key to being a master, I think, is always keeping that beginner mindset. And now I'm on the backside of like rock climbing, I can look at it so clearly and see like, oh, I just had a ton of ego. Like I wasn't a master at all. There was so much to learn. There's so much depth, but my ego blinded me from continuing to be curious and continue learning. And so that's why curiosity is so damn important. Yeah, speed is everything. I was watching Indian Wells is a tennis tournament that's happening right now, and it's in the desert of California. It's very, very windy. And one of the interesting things that the commentators are always talking about is like which players struggle in the wind versus which ones don't. And one of the things that they pointed out is that the fastball, like when you hit a hard ball in tennis, it's less affected by the wind because it has more speed, more velocity, more momentum behind it, that it can weather the storm a little bit better, doesn't get pushed around as much. But slow balls, they get pushed really hard by the wind. And one of the interesting things that happens in the wind is the players lose, or a lot of players lose confidence in their shot because the wind is pushing it all around. It's not going exactly where they wanted to. And so they subconsciously pull back and they stop hitting the ball as hard as they otherwise would. And the problem with that then is when they pull back and they hit softer, the wind affects the ball even more. And so now it's going even further wide than where they thought it was going to go, which affects their confidence even more, which becomes this negative spiral. And they stop hitting the ball even harder. The players that succeed are the ones that are like, I'm just going to hit through the wind. And they just pound the ball, and despite the fact that it's not landing exactly where they are, they know their best strategy moving forward is just to hit the damn thing as hard as they can. It's the same in life, man. Like the universe, the cosmic winds will push you aside if you move slow. So you just got to move really fucking fast. Yeah. Yeah. So many of the problems that we have in life are these things that they gain magnitude, they gain impact in our minds because they remain vague in general and undefined. Like I don't want to go, I don't want to put myself out there and go after this dream because I'm afraid of what people will say. And you're like, what people? And then you're like, oh, get more specific. What person in particular are you concerned about? And you're like, actually, I'm concerned about what my uncle thinks and what he's going to say at Thanksgiving. You're like, well, fuck uncle. Like, do you really actually care? Like, the more specific you get about who it is, right? And you could also just take a step, like in that same example, you have a problem because you're afraid of what people will think. And then you get specific about who actually it is that you care what they think. And then you go, do I actually care? You're like, no. Boom. You just solved the problem by deciding it wasn't even a problem. And there's so many instances of that, especially in business, where you go, this thing is on fire. And you're like, cool. Can we just like roll it out into the street and make it somebody else's problem and just ignore it? Like, well, I guess we could do that. Like, yeah, it's a dumpster fire. It doesn't have to be our dumpster fire. Just because you see fire doesn't mean you need to run towards it and put it out. Like, you can just decide, not my monkey, not my circus. I think a lot about religion and spirituality, and I have for a really long time. And I don't adhere to a religious belief around a God, Jesus, or anything like that, despite having studied religion in college. I was a youth pastor in a Lutheran church. So like I am very steeped in that world. And I was having a conversation with my dad a couple weeks ago about the fact that he is also not religious, and yet he very much was adamant about taking us to church every single week. Grew up Catholic, and then we transitioned to Lutheran when he got remarried. And I was like, why did we do that if you don't actually believe in God? I was just like, what is your stance here? And he goes like, the value of the path in say like Christianity or any religion doesn't really matter. It is not that it's going to get you to heaven. It's that it provides a constraint. It creates a framework, a structure that guides your life. And people that do not have structure or some kind of framework, do not have some kind of ethos, manifesto, whatever principles that they live by, they struggle. And for myself, this has been very true that when I was younger, really struggling with ADHD, I rebelled against the idea of anybody trying to tell me what to do, any kind of external authority. I hated structure. But what I found is that it's in the structure, it's in the constraint that you discover your ability to act freely, right? Like they say, necessity is the mother of all invention. I say that constraints are the father of all creativity. And as soon as you started like to create these guardrails in your life for your creativity, but also for the path that you're following, it keeps you moving in a direction instead of wandering all along the mountainside trying to figure your way out to the top. Because at the end of the day, like 99% of your life is spent on the mountainside. Only 1% of it is like ever at the peak. And as soon as you get to the peak, you come back down to go looking for another mountain. And so like the path, like the value of the path is that it constrains your progress. It constrains and focuses your efforts. And so pick a path. Pick a path. It will only serve you. This one's really hard because a lot of people like overthink decisions, right? So like you can make the right decision. I put all my chips in at the right moment, right? That was the right decision. Depending, let's say, on how it works out, right? But you don't get to control how the decision works out. What you can control is, did you make the decision the right way? And did you make the decision right? And so here's what I mean by that is like, Charlie Munger says you can make the right decision. No, what did he say? Is that it doesn't matter whether or not the decision was right. It matters whether or not you made the decision right. So like, was your thinking process? Is the decision that you use? So like in the game of poker, did you calculate the probabilities and odds correctly? Were you in the right position? Did you make the right play? And a lot of times you will make the right decision, right? But it won't necessarily play out how you wanted it to. And so you can't do anything about that. Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek said that you can do everything right and still lose. That's not weakness, that's life. And so just recognizing what is and what isn't within your control. When it comes to making the right decision, the two that you really want to focus on is your decision-making process solid? Did you actually arrive at a reasonable decision given the inputs that you had? A lot of people, they don't make good decisions because they don't actually have a very good formalized process for that. Second thing that you can control in here is after you make the decision, there's often a lot that you can do by just committing to it and trying really fucking hard to make it right. Like there's a lot of things, especially in business, where it's like there's these 3 different marketing channels that we could go after. We could focus all of our efforts on organic content on Instagram. We could focus on paid ads on Instagram, or we could just focus on referrals. Make your decision the right way. Go through the analytics, look at the data, look at your skills, your resources, your capabilities, and what works for your model, right? Once you pick one of those, though, all of them can work, but you have to make one of them work. And so committing and making the decision right through your actions after the fact. And committing, instead of saying like, okay, we committed to pay paid ads on Instagram. Well, go all in on learning that thing. Go take a course, watch all the videos, get a coach, work with a marketing agency to teach you everything that they know. Go in there and run 100 different variations every single day so that you can collect a ton of data, right? Go do everything within your power to make the decision right. And don't fixate whether or not it was ultimately the right decision. Because a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll pick a path, and then after 30 days, it's not working exactly how they thought. They go, maybe this was the wrong decision, and they pivot too soon. And they're thinking that there was a right decision there instead of just thinking, how can I make the decision that I made right? This is a really hard one, I think, because it is true that there are a lot of things that happen in the universe outside of your direct control. And when we talk about responsibility or the word fault, a lot of times, people will say it's not your fault or it is your fault, right? Like depending on their worldview. And if you operate from the position that everything is your fault, some people will come out and say, well, what if you're born with a disability? What if this thing happens? And they're like, yeah, you could get hit by a meteor. That's true. It might not be your fault, which is loaded language, but it certainly is your problem. And at the end of the day, you can't do anything to solve the problem if you don't at least accept responsibility for solving the problem. If you are forever saying, this isn't my fault, the universe threw this rock out of the sky and it hit me in the head, and now I just am the way that I am. Like you can accept that that's your circumstances. You can be upset about it and you can just wallow in your misery. Or you can say, you know what, this thing happened. Now it's my responsibility to do something about it. And that's just a better position. Whether or not it's factually true, it's one of those useful, if not true, situations where you need to operate as though everything is within your power, within your control, and take responsibility for it. Because at the end of the day, like if you refuse responsibility for your life, for your circumstances, if you're pointing it out as somebody else, you're directing power to that external circumstance. If you blame your parents for the reasons that you are the way that you are, then you're casting power to them. And at the end of the day, you will not succeed in life to the degree that you desire if you are constantly casting power away from yourself. You need to take it back to you. Now, that's not an indictment. It's not like any kind of judgment on your character to say like, this is my fault. It's just accepting the responsibility, accepting that the power is ultimately in your hands. And I think that's just a very powerful place to operate from.